Today on the Roundhouse, we're going to learn more about the EPA's emissions regulations and how they affect diesel locomotives in rail preservation. All aboard!
In days past, the roundhouse was where the railroad worker united with the steam locomotive, each to prepare for the journey ahead. Today, it's where we examine the history, the industry, the machines, the hobby, and the passion behind railroading. News, interviews, stories, and more. So climb aboard. This is The Roundhouse.
Welcome to the Roundhouse. I'm your host, Nick Ozerak, and this is episode number 143 of our Trains and Railroading podcast, where we're talking about everything in the industry and the hobby. You name it, and we discuss it. Today, we're talking to Roger Fuehring. He's the Chief Mechanical Officer for Lake State Railway, and he is going to talk about the EPA and their regulations concerning emissions from diesel locomotives. This is something that he's been engaged with the EPA directly and has gained a lot of knowledge. So we are going to talk about what locomotives fall under the regulatory arm and what you need to do to make sure you're in compliance. Before we get to that, though, I want to thank all of you who are supporting the Roundhouse podcast on Patreon. If you go to patreon.com/theroundhouse for as little as $1 a month, you're going to help make this show possible. And I appreciate that very much. And I want to thank the Mechanical Services Department of the Strasburg Railroad for sponsoring this episode. Learn more at mechanical.strasburgrailroad.com. Our guest today is the Chief Mechanical Officer for Lake State Railway Company and somebody who is very intimately familiar with the details on these incoming EPA emissions regulations. Please welcome back to the Roundhouse, Mr. Roger Fuehring.
Well, thank you, Nick. Glad to be here.
It's good to have you back. Last time you were on, you were talking about Amtrak and its recently changed regulations and rules regarding private cars on their trains. What is, in a nutshell, what we're looking at with regards to these EPA emissions regulations?
Well, there's a lot of, rumors going around and what have you, and it's good to kind of straighten this out a little bit. We don't know exactly what the future is going to hold completely, but basically to go backwards a little bit, 1998 was the first regulations. They came into being, and I think they actually went into full effect in the 2000. And then later upgraded in 2008 to what we call the 1033 EPA rules, which is found in the CFR. And those regulations all subject locomotive rebuilds, new builds for what they refer to different tier levels. And different tier levels basically was how much emissions does that particular locomotive push out. The most preferable one by the EPA standards would be a tier 4, which is what you see being built now. Most of us in the short line industry right now are running at best tier 0, tier 0 plus, and there might be some tier 1s out there. But for most of us, we're even including on your tourist operations and what have you, most of us have what we refer to as non-regulated locomotives, meaning that they did not meet the requirements of tier compliance yet for one reason or the other. And that might mean because they were a pre-1973 locomotive. If they were a post-73 locomotive, then there's certain restrictions that come into place with those locomotives, unless you're a small business. But right now, the current EPA regulations that are in effect have always been in effect. The way that they personally affect, let's say, tourist operations or small railroads, or if for any reason they have locomotives that have originally had the tier 0 upgrade or the tier 0 plus upgrade. So this might be your MP15s or your GP38s. If you're running one on the railroad, you have to stay in compliance. And that is where we saw some of the fines that came down from the EPA and some of the concerns we would have for those in the rail fan industry that are running tourist operations. Do they have any of those? And nothing's changed on those. The difference is they're enforcing regulations that were already in place. And some would say that because we're a small business, that doesn't apply. Well, the problem is with that is a tier locomotive that's once been a tier is always a tier locomotive. By certain requirements in which EPA has put into place that have always been into place since they first passed the rules back in the late 90s and upgraded in 2008. And the concern is out there right now is that we in the tourist industry, which I'm a freight railroader, but I've been around the tourist industry my whole life, is that we're making sure that everybody is complying with those regulations. And if they're not, making sure that they understand that they need to get them in compliance.
You came about this knowledge and this conversation because of your work in the freight industry as CMO at Lake State. How has it been to be part of the conversations with the EPA, and how has that helped to inform the conversation that you're having with them and educating them and their partners about this, as well as with the American Shortline and Regional Railroad Association?
Well, what happened is, I want to say it was 2022, roughly. We had EPA doing some presentations for us at conferences. This was before the notorious fines have come out that we're all familiar with, and locomotives being scrapped because they didn't meet requirements and what have you. We had approached the EPA on some of their interpretations. And some of the things, it's almost like we were having a wonderful, friendly conversation, but we were talking two different things, and something was off. So the American Shortline Association and Regional Railroad gave me permission to approach EPA, being we are in Saginaw, Michigan, and EPA's compliance office for these, missions are close to Detroit. They're in Ann Arbor, Michigan. They have a nice testing facility for testing automobiles and big trucks there. And so we started meeting with them on behalf of the American Shortline Association and the over 550 railroads we represent. And what we were looking for was something that we would refer to in our industry on the Federal Railroad Administration side as a compliance guidance, meaning how in the world do I interpret these regulations? Because when you read it, it'll make your eyes bleed. It's difficult. We can read FRA pretty good and understand it, but we weren't talking the same language. Come to find out, after several months of talking to them and running back and forth on, okay, what do we need to do as railroads that have tier locomotives to comply? For years, we went under the assumption, and it was an assumption that was led based on some of their previous presentations, that whenever we had a locomotive that exceeded 10 years after it was rebuilt into a tier locomotive, meaning less emissions, that at that point, based on their presentations, that we could go back with OEM parts whenever we had a repair to make. Well, OEM to me and most wrench turners, primarily gearheads, if I'm restoring a 1969 Chevelle and it doesn't have a carburetor on it, and I'm going to go back to OEM, it's going to end up with a carburetor under it and the right engine in it. And that's how we looked at a lot of those regulations, because we'd always been told you could go back to OEM for parts whenever you were doing your general maintenance, changing a head, a piston, a injector, after the 10 years has went past on the tier rebuild on the original engine. So that's what we were doing. Not just us, but pretty much every railroad out there. The problem is their definition, which we later learned in November of 2022 through the process of a conversation with myself and an engineer from EPA, their definition of OEM, even though it's not in the CFR anywhere, was based on the last tier rebuild. That resets OEM to them. So if I had, for example, a 1976 MP15, and it was past its 10 years since its major overhaul, and I was putting standard injectors in it. To the EPA, that's somewhat of a wrong interpretation of the rule, because OEM to them was, instead of 1976, it reset when the engine was rebuilt. So if the engine was rebuilt in 2002, that's the new OEM. So all of us in this, or most of the CMOs that I know within the American Short Line Association, our jaws kind of dropped when we realized what they had interpreted all these years. So we worked very diligently with few members within EPA to come up with a compliance guidance, and it ended up being 6 bullet points. Simple things you can do to stay in compliance if you have a tier locomotive that was tiered up, typically by a Class 1 railroad, and what you can do to stay in compliance. At that point, very few of us was probably in compliance. So we all went back and revisited our maintenance procedures and started getting this corrected immediately. And the other problem we had with this is a lot of the parts vendors and all that had good intentions, because they understood also that we could put their parts in once the 10 years ran out. So they would even advertise to us, hey, look, you can still put these in tier engines. The problem with that is there's also some, I wouldn't even call it fine print. It's pretty bold print in the 1033 regulations for the EPA. And that is, you can use best general practices, maintenance practices, after the 10 years run out, as long as you don't negatively affect emissions. That's the key word, negatively affected emissions. And what we find is if you're putting standard packs in, what we call power assemblies, which is a head, piston, and liner, if you're just putting that in a standard injector, you can't prove that you're not negatively affecting emissions. So the only way to do it properly is to put a certified pack in, preferably from the original certified kit of the power assemblies that are in there, the original tier kit that was sold by, all the various manufacturers that sold tier kits out there. So we went back in and we started putting in the correct ones in any location that it had been changed out on a locomotive that maybe we didn't use a tier pack on. And in addition, it also required us to start looking at the maintenance instructions from the original manufacturers. And this is probably where it comes into play with the tourist operations and the small railroads out there that might have tier engines. If your maintenance instruction calls for your injectors to be changed out every 3 years, you need to change your injectors out every 3 years based on the injector that went with that tier kit. If your turbocharger or blowers have to be changed out in a timeline, then you must change those out. You don't have to change all the packs out at the end of 10 years, even though some of the maintenance instructions will say that, because the way EPA looks at that resets the tier rebuild. And anytime you change out all 16 packs in an engine block within a 5-year span, you have to do a new tier kit if it's already been tiered. If you're a small business, that doesn't apply if it's been an engine that's never had a tier kit. So it's a little confusing. The key points is, if you have a tier engine, make sure you have the injectors changed out based on the maintenance instruction. If you have a tier kit, make sure the turbocharger's changed out, or the blowers if maintenance instruction calls for it. You do not have to change all the packs out after every 10 years from what EPA has told us. You just have to make sure when you change a pack, because you have a failed power assembly, that you change it with one, I would say, that's a certified pack. The way the writing is from EPA is that you can't negatively affect emissions. So with that being said, the best way to do it is put a certified pack in.
Something from our conversation that helps me to think about this is that if it has had a tier rebuild, then the locomotive has a sticker identifying that it has had a tier rebuild. And like a mattress, if it has a sticker on it, you don't take it off because that tier rebuild is in perpetuity for the remainder of the life of the locomotive, correct?
That is correct. And, so many times we see those stickers on there and we think, oh my goodness, well, I want to paint this back to my original C&O colors or whatever. And I don't want that sticker on there because sometimes on CSX locomotives, especially, they will have that sticker on the outside of the locomotive under the cab, normally on the frame rail, and also on the side of the engine block. Most of the tier kits had them just on the engine block, but CSX was a good example of one that had them on the outside, and it called for that in their maintenance instructions. Some of the earlier EMD ones, like on the MP15s from the Union Pacific that we had on our railroad, they were on the outside as well on the frame rail. It's highly recommended that you take a picture of that sticker. If anything ever happens to that sticker, you have to reproduce it. You need it back on that engine. There's got to be one in the cab as well. So at a minimum, they're on the sides of your engine block and they're in the cab of your engine. Those stickers just can't be taken off. They do say that, it's, I don't know if it says punishable by law, but it's similar to a mattress tag, which I know the mattress tag police have not been out that I know of in my lifetime, but and EPA is not necessarily out there looking for that. But to whitewash an engine, meaning to remove it as if it never had a tier, is you're playing with fire on that one.
To be clear, everything that you've outlined here, this is what is already in effect. It's just that now we have this greater understanding of what that effect is.
Correct. And, another thing, if you take a running takeout engine that was a tier engine, which is where you saw some of the violations at, if you take that out and you put in another running takeout engine and it's not a tier engine, you're in violation. So yeah, this is what's been in effect since 1998, revised in 2008. The EPA has been very generous in regards to, they don't come out for every little complaint. They typically will do an investigation by email and then calling. We've had some noise complaints here where we've had engines running at one location or another. As long as they see that you're rectifying the issue or trying to help with the issue, that's when they typically, if you're just kind of saying, there's not a problem here, and they keep getting complaint after complaint after complaint, then in that case, they're probably going to bump it up and you're probably going to get a visit. And when you get a visit, that's when they want to see those records that you have to have on file.
Having established this, what are some of the things that are coming down the pipeline that short line railroads and tourist railroads should be aware of?
Well, the good news is most of us currently are not affected by most regulations in regards to, let's say, my 1968 SD40, because we fall under a small business exemption, under 1,500 employees. Now, they will not accept holding companies as a small business if they exceed that amount. So the good news is for tourist operations or whatever, most of those locomotives are not an issue. It's only when you have the current engines that have been rebuilt into tier engines. But the new regulations, we're not sure what, if any, regulations will come about. What had happened is 4 or 5 years ago, I want to say 2016, was probably a letter from California Air Resource Board that was sent to the administration. There was another one followed up by San Juan Valley Air Quality Control out in California, asking for regulations to nationwide be more stringent. And the turnover of the older locomotives, meaning what me and you know as, everything from a GP7 on up, the EPA was a little surprised that they didn't see a larger turnover with those locomotives, meaning retired and replaced with, why aren't you buying tier 4 locomotives? They were surprised to see that. They were somewhat unfamiliar with the fact that we can make these things run as long as possible, as long as we keep the frame straight. The frame stays straight, you could keep that engine running for many, many years and keep rebuilding off that same frame of that locomotive anytime you need to. Well, that has caused some issues with when you look at the new movement for emissions. Now, keep in mind, we only account for, I think it's less than 2% of all emissions worldwide in regards to freight logistics. And I believe even passenger logistics when it comes to, passenger trains. So if anything, you should shift more to us for moving freight because we do less. But with that being said, we all know there's political pressures and things have changed in Washington a little bit where this is obviously more of an issue. So the EPA administrator asked in November of 2022 to put together a rail study team of the EPA as a result of those petitions from California, from CARB and San Juan Valley, to address their concerns. And that rail study group, which we at American Shortline and Regional Railroad Association have met with 4 times, not to mention multiple phone calls, emails, but we approached them in regards to the fact that when they passed the 2008 and the 1998 regulations, they never consulted any of the small railroads. They only consulted the class 1s. So with that, we were asking to have a seat at the table to be able to tell our story. And we all know telling the story is important because there's a lot of misconceptions when you only see what's on the news. We had some great groups come through from the EPA, several that were on the rail study group, great intentions, never stepped foot on a locomotive in their life. But yet these are the ones that were going to write the recommendations to the administrator of the EPA on what should be done with future emission rules. Originally, we had understood that their recommendations would be out in December of last year, so 2023, so just a month ago. However, it's been pushed back, and we had our final meeting with that group, and we had 8 members of that rail study team, all Environmental Protection Agency employees, including some that were involved in the original writing of the rules all the way back in the 90s. And we took them to a small railroad. This would have been the 3rd small railroad we took them to, as well as we met with them at their facility and took a tour of their facility. And we brought in other members of the American Shortline and Regional Railroad Association. The person I report to there, which I've been on loan to them to help with this. I don't work for the Shortline Association. I'm just a volunteer, but I work for Miss Jo Strang, who is really good about keeping up on all the regulations of everything that's going through Washington. We also had our mechanical chair and our environmental chair there, and we met with them for the last time on January 11th. The outcome of that meeting at the end was very promising, and the outcome ended with them making it very clear that they were unaware of some of our issues in the industry. And a good example is I might park 4 non-regulated locomotives and replace those with Tier 0 plus newer locomotives. But yet, if I sell those non-regulated locomotives that don't have tier kits, but they're 3,000 horsepower, and I sell them to Railroad A that has a bunch of old Jeep 9s that are 1,750 horsepower, and they replace them, suddenly, instead of having 3 GP9s on a train, they're only going to have 1 GP40. And those are the things that we showed EPA where we were already cutting emissions by actually taking these non-regulated locomotives and keeping them in the pool by helping out these smaller short lines by retiring some of their older ones. So they have less power on the train. Let's face it, fuel costs are expensive. It only makes sense to have less power on the train. Those were things that the EPA had never seen before. So they were very complimentary on the fact that these are things they never saw. They were very open to some of our struggles and concerns within the industry. And even though the recommendations will still come out, from our understanding, we believe the recommendations won't come out until after the election. We do feel like we will continue to have a seat at that table to hopefully make sure we don't end up with the severe regulations you have in California. With that being said, one of the issues with California is the EPA did come out and remove what we refer to as the preemption rule. And that meant that the EPA only could set these regulations, and the states couldn't have something that was so drastic, especially for the small businesses, that it would affect interstate commerce. So they removed that preemption rule and the big truck rule that they just passed this year. And there is litigation over that. But the process on that is the states have to, if they want to make stricter rules than the EPA, to, let's say, make sure everything's Tier 4 locomotives by 2030, they have to petition the EPA in order to do that. And from my understanding, as of to date, the EPA has not approved California's petition on that yet. Now, that may have changed by the time this gets aired, but that is a concern if that starts happening. If the states start saying, hey, we want to have stricter regulations, they could petition the EPA. Those are the scenarios where you, in your tourist railroad industry, your small railroads, you've got to talk to your legislators. You need to talk. You need to be vocal. If there's a comment period at any time, you need to comment. The little bit of shiny news out of the CARB rule, which is California Air Resource Board, is that as of July of 2022, they did exempt, at that time, it was 22 locomotives that are in tourist operations or museums that had very restricted use, meaning they could still be used, but they had to be in their original configuration. There's some real fine lines on what original configuration means, though. So, I mean, they could rescind those at any time. But we kind of always hope that we can protect some of these older locomotives and that we're not just looking at them stuffed and mounted, as we call it, in a museum because the railroad's not allowed to fire them up. So that's some of the concerns for the tourist industry as we go forward.
The Strasburg Railroad is an institution in the heritage railroad industry, and its mechanical services department is proud to lead the way. With the knowledge and experience that has created one of the most reliable steam railroading experiences in the country, the Strasburg Railroad is excited to offer their expertise to the rest of the industry. Strasburg's professional team provides consulting and technical assistance to take your steam locomotive or rail car project from idea to finished product. They stand behind their work and always strive to meet their customers' needs for quality, historic accuracy, and reliability at a price that is fair. Unlike many competitors, they feature a fully equipped boiler, rail car, and machine shop, so the work gets done in-house, helping you get more for your money. Send your inquiries to mechanical@strasburgrailroad.com and let the professionals get to work for you. Just so we understand the stakes, what are the current California regulations that there's this concern that could expand to other states?
Well, I don't have the rule right in front of me because I refused to do this with no notes, so I just did it ad lib. But from my, if things would have been approved by EPA on the petition, which could happen at any moment, effective the first of the year, they would have had to start looking at reporting requirements. I think within a few years, there was a requirement that if you had an engine that was not a tier locomotive, I believe tier 2 or less was the issue, but especially non-regulated locomotive that would affect historic operations. Those locomotives you would have to start paying a penalty. And the penalty was steeper than any railroad could afford. I mean, it exceeded your gross revenue, basically. And what happened with that penalty is that rolled over into a fund that would be part of some type of grant process that would help you buy locomotives. I believe it was by a certain drop dead date, so don't quote me on it, but I think it was like 2030. At that point, then you had to have all Tier 4 locomotives, I believe, or Tier 3. I don't remember the exact requirements, but it was something that was so strenuous that the short lines that we represent at the American Short Line Association just weren't going to be able to operate. And some of the responses back from some of the California officials were like, oh, well, it's in this case, they felt that the global warming issues or climate change issues were more of an issue than allowing them to continue to run, even though a lot of those small railroads served factories that can't go without rail service. So some of the issues with receiving the grant money and let's say getting a Tier 4 locomotive, you are now locked in with a Tier 4 locomotive with buying parts from just that supplier and only that supplier. Anybody that's turned wrenches on an EMD or an old Alco or even an OG could tell you in a lot of cases, you can find multiple part sources for our locomotives. That's what keeps the prices down. If we have to go to a Tier 4 locomotive to replace a non-regulated locomotive or a Tier 0 plus, let's say GP40, if we had to go to a Tier 4 instead of that GP40, now what you find yourself involved in is a restricted on where you can buy your parts. Secondly, you have no price protection on those parts. Those parts can multiply frequently, which they do. And then you have proprietary rights on those parts. So let's say a part does go out and you can't get it and you think you can source it elsewhere. You couldn't if you wanted to, because you can only buy from that supplier. Well, if they tell you it's a 6-week lead time, which by the way, I have an electronics component right now in a locomotive that has proprietary, requirements on it, meaning that only they can sell it. And I have a locomotive sitting for 16 weeks waiting on a part. Most operations can't afford that, to be down 16 weeks without their locomotive, especially if they only have 2 or 3 locomotives to begin with. So those potential state regulations that could come about. And secondly, even if the EPA does go in and change regulations, that's the time people need to make sure they're making their voice heard and commenting during the comment periods. Because even though these are maybe class 1s or short lines and regional railroads, these locomotives all eventually roll down to the tourist industries, to the small operations, and they just won't be available no more.
From what you say, a key moral of this story, in terms of that it's a continual process with this issue, is make sure that your organization or your company is making friends in your community, in your legislation, because those have enormous long-term ramifications in terms of your ability to advocate your case. And that's true even outside of this specific issue, but even for the tourist railroads that say operate steam locomotives, being able to have your allies is so key.
Absolutely. The days of us taking an Alco out there and doing a photo run by and say, let's get her smoking good, need to stop. That just the visual's not good. You can't avoid that with steam locomotives. And steam locomotives are exempt from the current regulations, and there's been no comment on going any further with that. But at the same time, it's we tell a great story out there. We've all been around steam operations. I grew up around steam operations, and the communities love us out there, and they get to see where we came from and what have you. When you're looking at the current decarbonization, which, by the way, there are others involved with regulations on locomotives. Department of Energy right now is looking at some things. It's really weird how some of the government agencies are crossing lines. They currently have 4 government agencies that are involved in some decarbonization research as far as looking at what could be done in order to achieve net zero by 2050. Now, 2050, to most young people does not sound that, or sounds pretty far away. But for a guy like me that is in his 37th year of railroading, I feel like a kid still. I'll be honest with you. I still remember my first days operating with GP7s and 9s. And it went quick. And to imagine me looking out to 2050 and thinking there won't be any combustion diesel locomotives left able to run. If the technology's there, then great. As we see on our TV screens with the recent weather, the battery operated cars are being towed off the highways. They lose 40% of their charge rate, or how far they can go, their distance, and their charge rate takes longer. We're not experimenting right now with battery operated locomotives up here where it's cold. We can't. There's not enough power grid to charge them in some cases. But secondly, we don't have the distance with them. So the last thing I want to see is us at 2050 having our kids or grandkids out there and showing them a train go by and it make no noise at all. But, part of that in me is because I'm older, and these locomotives mean a lot to me, and I've grown up with them. And, I feel like we're a responsible way to ship in the United States for shipping cargo and what have you, until technology catches up. Because even with hydrogen locomotives, from my understanding, it takes 23 gallons of water to make the equivalent of 1 gallon of diesel fuel. It's great stuff. We should continue to experiment with it and learn from it and develop. But there comes a point right now you can't regulate something that doesn't exist yet, and you can't regulate something that's going to put us in financial harm and stop us from serving customers that the trucking industry couldn't keep up with if they wanted to. I mean, you can't put a 100-car grain train on trucks and ship it across 5 states. It's not feasible.
So as you're reflecting on the conversations that you've had over the past year about this, and you're seeing the direction that things are going, what are some final thoughts that you have as far as what people should be aware of when looking into this?
Well, first and foremost, I can't tell you how great it's been to work with the EPA and how there's some gearheads in the EPA. I mean, I'm just going to say they like their old hot rod cars as well, but they have been tremendous. I can't, we're all living in a politically charged world right now. And I can't state it enough that even for your listeners that may be responding to this podcast and what have you, is there are good people on both sides that are trying to solve what they feel is a real issue with emissions. We can do this responsibly with the railroad industry. If you are in that boat and you're letting this get under your collar, just remember when they ask for comment periods to look into that, comment on it. We are not out there killing people. I mean, that's been some comments I've seen on the other side. And, we just had somebody that retired from the Norfolk Southern out of Frankfort, Indiana, hired out on the nickel plate, 65 years. Man's still living. So we're not killing people that's directly in with these locomotives and working around them every day. We can be part of the solution with reducing emissions by shifting more things to freight on our railroads. We can't do it without our trucker friends. We've got to have truckers sometimes for the final mile. That's where transload comes in. That's where so many of us in the shoreline industry are making huge strides. But I can't stress enough to just lower the temperature. Don't get upset because they want to chop up your locomotive and go to net zero. A lot of this is just talk. However, there are, members within the regulatory groups, within our elected officials even, that really want to see us get there. And that's fine if we can get there with the technology that works. But right now, it's not there. If you are a tourist operation, you have a Tier 0 or Tier 0 plus locomotive that's been donated to you, make sure you get it in compliance. I can't stress that enough.
Agreed. Roger, thank you so much for joining us here on the Roundhouse and being able to explain this issue. It certainly makes a lot more sense to me, and I hope it makes a lot more sense to our listeners as well.
Thank you, Nick.
And now, the question of the day.
Last time on the Roundhouse, we were talking about the Allegheny Portage Railroad, which transported people up inclines using, at the time, state-of-the-art technology, which led to the question, What is an underrated technological marvel in railroading? A lot of interesting responses were collected, and thank you guys who submitted your comments. First, from Kristen Fredrickson on Facebook, underrunning third rail. Philip Bushdecker writes, conical wheel taper. It's such a simple concept, and it's easy to take it for granted. Yet without it, railroading as we know and love would not be possible. Kenny Broomfield writes, air brakes, especially when you consider the amount of lives that have been saved. And David Rayleigh adds on to that, the kind of utility that the mechanical system, the air brakes can provide is really impressive. The fact that you can have a system that requires air to be released, so as if air leaves the brake pipe, the train stops, but if you bleed the air out of the cylinder in a rail car, you can move it freely and kick it without the need of air, has been fascinating to me ever since I first started working for a railroad. And lastly, from YouTube, WMRR Fireball writes, I think lubricants and lubricant distribution systems are not flashy, but nothing runs for long without it. All wonderful submissions, and it's great to remember how important this technology is to railroading that we have today. Your question of the day for this episode is, what are topics that you would like for me to cover on the podcast? Let me know on the roundhousepodcast.com. Links to social media are there. Guys, it is always a treat to be able to talk with you about things going on in the railroading industry and hobby. And it's so wonderful to have you along for the ride. Remember, as always, that the Roundhouse is our house.